Hello, I am back. Alright, now it's time for part 2 of who I think the killer is, and I will try to look at the camera more than at my laptop. So, the second killer, I think, is Piper. I almost said Sydney from the first movie, the main character, protagonist. Anyway, Piper, alright? Piper is pretty unobtrusive in the story. I mean, she just kind of floats around in the background, pops up at various times, gives information, just kind of floats away. She doesn't even say where she gets the information from. She always just says, I did research. Well, okay, you did research. I believe you. You're trustworthy. But anyway, for some more concrete sort of evidence. So the first episode that Piper appears in is episode 2 called Hello, Emma. Alright? So that, I think that should mean something right there. Right? That I kind of think that's a hint. Also, Piper, she goes to Noah and Audrey, actually, before she even meets Emma. When she does meet Emma, she goes to Emma's work at the cafe. And when she talks to Emma, she knows who Emma is, even before she meets her. Like, she must know who she is, right? She knows about Emma's family history. She knows about Emma's dad being the last survivor. She knows about, the Brandon James attack, at least somewhat, which is kind of odd, right? And so she says the reason that she has this information is that she did research, and that's all she says. And Emma kind of takes that at face value, right? And another thing she says that I think is important is that, she is there to find the truth. And this is something she repeats a lot, right? And I kind of think this plays into her character, which I may explain in another video why they're the killers. Alright, when I tie Noah and Piper together. But anyway, like later in that episode, that same episode, episode 2, like Emma gets locked out of the cafe and she's confronted by a hooded figure in the alley. And I think Piper could easily set this up. She could see, hey, when Piper goes outside to take out the trash or whatever she's doing, and she could tell her partner, possibly Noah, hey, she's out there. Piper could lock the door, and the person in the alley could scare her, right? And I think that person would be Noah, right? Another thing is that Piper also narrates a couple of episodes. So she narrates the opening for episode 4. She talks about knowing the group and how much it hurts, alright? She's been in one freaking episode. How can she know the group? And how can she know how much it hurts? I mean, that's a pretty bold statement for a new person, right? Another thing in episode 4 is that Piper listens to Audrey confront the sheriff over the investigation of Rachel's death. So she kind of listens in, and then she turns around and pretends not to be listening, but she's still listening. Alright? And I know that's because she's a reporter, but she could also be collecting information as the killer. That's just kind of shady. Alright. In episode 4, Piper also talks to Emma at the cafe briefly, and she kind of blames the sheriff and tries to discredit him for his investigation. And she says that the sheriff won't be the only scapegoat. So if she's the killer, they could have a plan for who's going to be the scapegoat and who isn't going to be. And we know that later in the hospital, there's a list of people in town, maybe some shady people, alright, that could be used as scapegoats, right? And also in episode 4, when Piper is about to leave town, she kind of admits to knowing about the hospital, which is something, she probably could have told Emma if she knew about that. And she gets Emma to ask her to stay, right? Like, this isn't over. She's kind of like, oh, it's over. And then Emma convinces her to stay. And also, in that episode is when Emma's sex tape is released, and she's with Emma when the sex tape's released, so she's there to comfort her and build trust. Alright? In episode 5, Piper asks Emma about the killer after Emma thinks that she sees the killer at a vigil. And, one thing she points out is that all the murders are related, except for Rachel. That's anomalous. I mean, maybe there's a different set of killers working, and Rachel was killed, and she's not really sure, hey, why is this other killer in my territory? But she also said the killer may be sending the medical examiner a message with Rachel's death. So I kind of think that maybe Piper is Brandon James' kid, because she does talk about her father dying at a young age where she couldn't even remember her father. So if her mother is the same mother that Emma has, then maybe she's trying to send her mom a message like that. Right? She also points out the link between the photos of Emma's family that are found in the hospital. They're all kind of their family, and how would she know about that? I mean, in episode 5, Piper gives Emma alcohol, but she doesn't really console her. She relates that life is like Charlie Brown, where you're trying to kick the football and someone's constantly pulling it away from you, right? And she might be doing that as one of the killers. They give her Emma information. They kind of think, hey, we're making a break, and then boom, no, that's the killer's not who you think it is. But she tells Emma to keep trying. So in this way, I think she's kind of toying with her, just like how Noah said the killer wants to play cat and mouse games. Alright, in episode 5, Piper also reveals that her own father was murdered, and that the police never solved it, and she didn't think the police tried very hard. So this, again, makes me think that she's probably Brandon James's child, right? Obviously Brandon James was possibly murdered, and we know later on when the killer breaks in the police, someone breaks in the police station, looks through the notes on the Brandon James case, that the cops just couldn't find the body and stopped the investigation. So that kind of fits perfectly with Piper's backstory here. In episode 5, Piper also tells Emma that she found her line of work because she was always asking questions, right? So as a child, we know that Brandon James's child was given up for adoption by Emma's mother's parents, right? We don't know where the child went, but it's very possible that the child never knew her dad was Brenda James or where she came from, but she kept asking questions, who am I? Why am I here? I mean, the child could have even been deformed, right? And wanted to find out why. Or different from her parents or his parents and wanted to find out why. We don't know it's a boy, but this is my theory that she's that. And she also says that everyone has personal demons, right? Which is, something Brandon James's child would definitely say if they knew the story of their father. And it would also be true of the killer, right? Someone was something terrible in their past. Those are the demons, right? In episode 6, Piper talks a lot with Will, and she kind of mocks him a little bit for being good, which he later gets killed. And she also asks for information about Nina, and she hints about Will giving her information about a different story, and later Will offers her another story. So they had some kind of deal where Will was going to give her a certain set of information, but later that changes and Will offers her another story. That story turns out to be that Will and Jake and Tyler are blackmailing the mayor for money, right? Well, Piper ends up going with Will, and she gets the story on the mayor, and then she's like, oh, well, that's interesting, right? Interesting new story. And then, bam, the killer shows up. Now, here's something that's really odd, all right? killer comes up behind Tyler and Piper. Or not Tyler, he comes up behind Will and Piper, right? Will accidentally knocks Piper down, right? And Piper gets knocked unconscious. The killer drags Will away, doesn't even bother to check on Piper, doesn't, stab her to finish her off, because Will at this point is kind of like down. He can't really defend himself. Right? Then that's kind of odd. Like, why would the killer just leave Piper there? And what's even stranger is that later on, when Piper talks to Jake and Brooke, she says, "Oh, Will saved my life. He sacrificed for me," right? And then when she talks to the sheriff, she says, "Oh, the killer left me this mark on my head," right? She says that the killer did that to her, but actually it was Will, and it was by accident. Why would she try to put the blame on the killer for doing this? And why would the killer leave her alone unless she was working with the killer? Right? And unless they're trying to, set up someone else in the future, right? In the next episode, Piper again does the opening narration for episode 8, in which she described, what happened at the bowling alley. And she's also the one that goes to the police, and she gives them the video of the mayor putting a body in her car. She also kind of like talks to Brooke that she did the right thing to turn on her father. And she also tries later to get Emma, to believe the mayor's guilty of something, right? So again, going back to that scapegoat, they're trying to create another scapegoat. It's like, hey, the mayor's putting a body in this car. He's guilty of something. He's a killer, right? He's being blackmailed. Maybe this is why he's bumping off students. But, hey, maybe the killers didn't know what body was being put in the car, right? So, in episode 8, Piper also says that Will made her part of the story, and she feels that she's kind of part of the group, right? So, earlier she said that she kind of says like she has a connection to this group, and now she says she's part of the group and part of the story, right? And you would think as a journalist that she'd want to be kind of objectively separate from the story, but I don't see how she could be quite as emotionally invested. I mean, Will didn't really save her life, she just kind of got lucky, right? And she also, in episode 8, tells Emma that she will survive and that she must fight back. And maybe this is setting up Emma to kill a potential scapegoat in the last episode. She mentions how Emma's family are survivors, and encourages her to keep looking for answers. So, and this is the thing about Piper, like she kind of gives Emma breadcrumbs, and then she pushes her. It's like, hey, keep looking. Even though she has a ton of information, it seems like. She doesn't give it all at once. She just kind of gives it piece by piece. Like, hey, Emma, keep looking into this and keep looking into that. And she also seems kind of concerned about Emma's relationship with her mom. She kind of and her dad, too. I mean, she asks, hey, have you, have you... Emma's dad comes to the hospital and talks to Emma. And then later, Piper's like, well, I lost my dad. She's like, you get second chances rarely. You should keep your dad in the picture. And I kind of think maybe this is setting up next season that, Emma's dad is being drawn out possibly by the killer. That maybe Emma's dad framed Kevin James for the previous murders, and the killer is killing people and putting his daughter in danger, which will lure him out. The current killer being Brandon James's child, possibly Piper. So I think what's going to happen is that, they're going to get Emma's dad out of hiding, out of wherever he's gone to, and then they can get their revenge for killing Brandon James, or at least ruining his good name. Alright, so that's kind of one of the theories I have working here. So, going back to more information about Piper, she visits Piper in the hospital as a friend right? Even though she doesn't really know her that much. And then later, Piper trusts her enough, or Emma trusts Piper enough to go ahead and ask for videos that she can use. Alright, and then going on to the last episode, episode 9. Episode 9 opens with Piper narrating a Halloween podcast. She wonders where Brandon James's mask went. And early, at the very beginning of the episode, well, we see someone stole it, right? She encourages the sheriff to focus on Mr. Branson and dig deeper into his activities, maybe the year before he stole the mask. We don't actually know when Mr. Branson came to town, but it would have had to be in the last 2 years because 2 years previously he was Seth Palmer working in a different place in New England, right? So she's kind of like pushing people to say, hey, Mr. Branson, he's probably the murderer, keep looking into him, keeping people distracted while they work up their final plan, right? So in episode 9, Piper talks to the sheriff and criticizes him for having the dance and saying it's irresistible to the killer. And she hints that the dance could prove Mr. Branson's innocence. So if the killer strikes at the dance while Mr. Branson's in jail, that would prove Mr. Branson's not the killer. If she wants people to think Mr. Branson is the killer, alright, she can't possibly kill anyone while he's in jail, because then people will know, hey, he's not the killer. What happens at the end of the episode? Mr. Branson gets sprung, right? He is freed from jail without any witnesses, right? So that kind of makes it look like, hey, Mr. Branson is the killer, and there's a dead sheriff in the police, or a deputy sheriff in the police station, right? Who can't say who freed Mr. Branson or not. And I'd like to point out, too, that how did the killer free Mr. Branson, right? Well, the killer knocked out the sheriff, right? And when he knocked out the sheriff, he could have taken the sheriff's keys, the sheriff's gun, and the sheriff's radio. And those would have allowed him to enter him or her to enter the police station, alright, probably unlock a lot of the doors, and to have a weapon to force anyone that they met inside the police station to do what they wanted them to do, or to kill them, or, make them captive. Because the deputy is actually handcuffed to the cell door, right? And that could have been done with the sheriff's handcuffs, for all we know, right? And we don't know, was the deputy shot, or were they stabbed? I mean, there's no way to know that because we haven't examined the body or anything, right? Another thing in episode 9 is that, Piper shows up with information about finding Brandon James's mother, alright? How she find her, we don't know. Research. And she says, hey, I've talked with Brandon James's mom earlier. Let's go check her out. They go check her out, and she turns out to be a crazy old lady. Now, it's interesting if you look in that scene, when Emma is talking with Mrs. James. Alright, Piper isn't watching Mrs. James and participating in the conversation. She's intently looking at Emma. She's watching Emma's reactions to what Mrs. James says. So I think this entire time that Piper wants Emma to put all these pieces together and figure out, that Brandon James and her mom had a kid, that kid was given up for adoption, that kid's possibly still alive, right? She wants her to see, her mother is a bad person, maybe. Maybe she wants to split up the family. Maybe she wants to reconnect with the sister she never had. It's really hard to say her motives, but there's one thing for sure. She wants Emma to find the truth, alright? So, she talks and she finds out, Emma finds out more about, Brandon James and kind of what happened with her mother, right? And, Piper tries to get Mrs. James to figure out, hey, it was his son, and he had these old-time movie star looks, right? I mean, that could be anyone. It said, maybe his name was Seth. Well, hey, if you know what's going on, and you have someone you're trying to frame, Noah could easily go in there and say, "Hey, I'm Seth. I'm Brandon James' son. Let's talk about dear old dad," right? So I think it's entirely possible that, they're setting all this up. Because later, Piper finds Emma again, and she says, "Hey, I went back and talked to Mrs. James, and she said, oh yeah, Kieran's the bad guy here. Like, he's Brandon James's son." But we don't know that. We haven't seen Piper's 2 conversations with Brandon James's mother. So we have no idea what they actually said to each other, right? So again, I think she's, putting a football in front of her, just like Charlie Brown, and then yanking it away, and like, oh no, wait, here's some more information. Alright? So, and when she kind of implicates Kieran, she waits till Kieran leaves the dance, right? So, I think that's kind of important. And then after she kind of drops this bombshell about, hey, maybe Kieran's the killer, right? Maybe he's Brandon James's son, right? Right after that, on the screen, the whole thing with the sheriff pops up. So isn't that kind of coincidence? And I'd like to point out, too, that Noah's the one running the show. And he could easily, with his tech savvy, put that video on screen. Or, even Piper could put it on. What better cover would there be for Piper and Noah to be in the same room when that video comes on? That video has no audio to it, I think. It could easily be pre-recorded. The killer actually kind of, talks to Emma on her phone. The killer doesn't talk to Emma on the screen, right? And I think that's a clue that, hey, this could be previously recorded footage that's been placed here, right? But you think you're talking to the killer in real time, but who knows, right? So those are kind of some reasons that I think, Piper is the killer, and I do think she's Brandon James's son, due to some of the things she says and some of the things that have happened in the series. So those are my thoughts on why Piper is killer number 2. So I might do one more video and try to tie these 2 crazy kids together with some of the facts about the actual killer. So thanks for watching again, and see you next time.